At the beginning, I talked mostly about the basic science of climate change in the hope that if we all know the causes of climate change, of global warming, we'll work hand in hand and fight against this climate crisis. But very sadly, this is not the case. After more than 10 years of talking here and there, I don't see any momentum building up in the society. Well, lately I see some changes. So I switched to something else. So that's why I choose a rather different topics. Climate tipping point is mentioned by MCs, but I would share a little with you about the COP27, which has just been concluded in Egypt not last week. So what is COP27? It is the abbreviation for Conference of Parties, the 27th Conference of the Parties. So what are Conference of the Parties? Well, actually, in the international community, we have lots and lots of treaties, right? All countries in the world sign up for a common cause. As far as the environment is concerned, we also have a number of international treaties, or sometimes called convention. One of those is the Vienna Convention on the Protection of Ozone Layer. Because in the 1980s, we know that there is a hole in the ozone layer, right? And it is bringing very bad health impacts to particularly people in the southern hemisphere. So people gather together, countries gather together to form a convention, sign a convention so that everyone will work together. And that is a convention, the Vienna Convention. And in the 1990s, we started to find out that a lot of wild species are disappearing. They're dying. So it seems that a new mass extinction has begun. So in the 1990s, we have the Convention on the Biodiversity. Right? So these are the international treaties. So about this COP, it is Conference of the Party of can I move down? Why? Yeah. Okay. 睇唔到。我諗佢個 presentation 冇嘅得。我落到呢張，但係佢仍然 show 緊呢張。點解？我諗對翻 presentation 冇嘅得。Page down. Yeah, that is it. So we are talking about the Conference of the Parties of an International Treaties called on the left top corner, you see United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that is the international treaty we're talking about. And for any international treaties, the highest ruling party is called the Conference of the Parties. You know, you have more than 190 countries signing a certain convention. Then every now and then they gather together and discuss the way forward. And that is what happens in the Conference of the Party. So the COP27 is actually the 27th Conference of the Party held in Egypt to operationalize the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what is a framework convention? Lots of terminology, right? A framework convention is just an international treaty laying down the broad principles and objective of a certain issue. In this case, it's about climate change. So what is the broad objective? What is the general principles and so on? Now, laying down the general principles, we have to do something, some implementation, in order that we can save the world, so to speak, against the climate crisis. There comes some kinds of protocols or agreement. So in the case of climate change, we have a Kyoto Protocol, which is signed in 1997 and become operational in the year 2005. And then we have the Paris Agreement in 2015 and so on. So this is what we meant by the Conference of the Party. Well, the first Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, took place in 1995, and that is called the COP1. You can probably recognize from this picture that the chair lady was Angela Merkel, the former Prime Minister or President of Germany, Prime Minister, I suppose. At that time, in 1995, she was the Environment Ministry. And in that meeting, COP1, one of the sort of consensus is that all countries should come together to negotiate strengthened commitments for developed countries. I highlighted this point because we have more than 190 countries in the world. Some countries are more capable of working towards a certain objective because they have the money, they have the technology, and so on. But on the other hand, we have lots of underdeveloped countries who need the help of developed countries to do so. And that was recognized in COP1 in 1995, 27 years ago. And then this year, we have a Conference of the Party held in Egypt, and you can see that this is one of the cities in Egypt overlooking the Red Sea. It is in the northernmost part of the Red Sea. The name of that place, I don't know how to pronounce it, is called Sharm el-Sheikh. It is so beautiful with turquoise, clear turquoise water, and above all, we have 4-star, 5-star hotels, that it is very difficult to reconcile the discussion of life and death matters, which is climate crisis, in such an environment, right? So it is too beautiful a backdrop of negotiation of life and death matters. As a matter of fact, during the opening speech of the United Nations Secretary General, he said that we are on the way to climate hell. So situated in such a beautiful place, how can you imagine that we are going towards climate hell? So a lot of criticism before even the Conference of the Parties started. Right? Some criticized the forum or the COP27 as a forum for greenwashing, and others criticized Egyptian regime, criticizing it as repressive. But to me, I think Egypt, in particular that city, is a fitting location. Why is that? Because Africa lays bare the inherent inequality or inequity of climate change. Why do I say that? The whole of Africa, the African continent, is responsible for less than 4% of all the carbon dioxide emissions so far. But on the other hand, it is on the front line of suffering, exacerbated by climate change. The word exacerbation is very important, because I'm not saying that climate change. Oh, okay. Okay.咁我都係 page down 係咪啊？或者用呢個？係啊，佢唔知乜 Zoom 入邊會睇到個 screen。哦，即係有人喺 Zoom 度睇緊嘅。哦，我知。直接 share 成個 screen。share 係 share screen 係咯。
有可以 share PowerPoint 嘅。
No problem.
你 share 個 screen，
share screen 就穩陣少少。Good idea.
So I think we have solved the technical problem right now. Exactly. So I just want to reiterate my emphasis on the word exacerbation, because I'm not saying that climate change is the cause of all those disasters, weather disasters. It's just making those disasters worse by increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. So as a result, because the African continent only contribute to less than 4%, they are the least responsible countries or people to suffer from those climate disasters. But this year, 2022, we noticed that from the news that we have millions of people probably dying from hunger or suffering from hunger. Well, of course, the cause is not climate or weather alone, because we have the Ukrainian war, which also contributes to the hunger problem. And if you look at this chart, which is what we call the climate change vulnerability, this axis is the index, the vulnerability index. So lower on the axis, we have extremely high vulnerable, and up in the axis are those places which are low in vulnerability. So we see that for Europe, they are high in the chart, meaning that they are they are not vulnerable at all. But then for the African continents over there, they are extremely vulnerable. So that represents the injustice we see as a result of climate change. And climate change actually magnifies the problem. And I say that Africa is the right location, the appropriate location to hold the COP27 for another reason. It is about colonialism. Why? Because, you know, in the 18th century, 19th century, in particular, in the 20th century, we have the scramble for Africa. The Western countries in Europe literally divide Africa amongst themselves. Within a span of just 40 years in the scramble for Africa, 90% of Africa was under the control of European powers. And of course, when they colonize Africa, their purpose is not for the benefit of the African people. Their sole purpose is to extract the resources in terms of human and resources in terms of natural, right? So what they form as an institution, as a governance, is not for the long-term sake. As a result, in 1960s, when the UN reached a resolution that there should not be any colonies in the world, then the Western powers leave Africa, leaving behind a wreck, and leaving behind the people very poor, very vulnerable, and without the kind of education and infrastructure for good governance and so on. Therefore, the history tells us that Africa is the one suffering the most as a result of Western influence. So that concept was brought up in COP27 this year. It's called loss and damage, because a lot of countries, in particular the poor countries, are suffering from loss and damage resulting from extreme weather. And this is the first time that loss and damage was put on the agenda of that international conference. But as a matter of fact, it's nothing new, because countries like Kiribati, as I mentioned here, in the top picture, which is a country probably submerged underwater in maybe decades as a result of rising sea level and so on. So these countries, low-lying countries, poor countries, join force to press for a fund the international insurance funds, so that whenever they are suffering from climate disasters, they get compensated. The nature is, of course, compensation and reparation. But obviously, this is a term which is considered a taboo in international negotiation. No country, in particular the powerful country, wants to accept the inconvenient truth. No country wants to accept responsibility. So they use a more neutral term, the loss and damage and so on. Well, that concept was brought up in the Paris Agreement in 2015, and in the document they address the importance of loss and damage and so forth and so on. Now comes a problem. How can we be sure that if a country suffers from some climate disaster, like Pakistan this year, 30 million people were affected as a result of the flood? How can we be sure that this is a result of climate change if and when we have a fund to sort of compensate them? How can we be sure? Well, in the old days, maybe 10 years, 15 years before, we don't have any answer. But now we do, because we have computer models. And we can ask the computer model to do different simulations and to compare the results of case one, where we have no human being, no carbon dioxide emission. What is the chance? What are the chances of such severe weather happening? And then we run the computer model once again, this time simulating the real conditions with all the carbon dioxide emission, greenhouse gases emission, and so on. So we know how much the problem is exacerbated, and then we can work out the compensation. So luckily, COP27 succeeded in at least one thing, which is that all countries reach a consensus. As a matter of fact, during the process of negotiation, the US, the EU threatened to walk out from the conference. They don't want to discuss anything about loss and damage, but somehow they managed to reach a conclusion so that for the following year, hopefully, some concrete procedures will be set up for this concept. Now I want to, for the sake of matters, I want to talk a little bit about the urgency of climate change. In this map here, which is very busy, very complicated, we have on the left top side tipping points. We have a concept called tipping points of climate change. Interestingly, this term, tipping point, when it is first coined, was about some racial differences, racial discriminations, and so on. As a matter of fact, in the US, in the old days, if you have a certain neighborhood or certain city, when there are more and more black people living in that neighborhood, the white people will start to move out from that neighborhood when the number of black persons increases to a certain point, and that point is called the tipping point. So the first usage of that point is actually about racial discrimination. Now it means that when a certain system, such as a climate system, or certain component of a climate system, reaches a certain point, then there is probably reaching the point of no return. So we have, as I circled here, lots and lots of those tipping points. As a matter of fact, in recent literatures, scientists pointed out that there could be as many as 15 tipping points in the climate system. I'm going to highlight just a few. For example, this is about the dying out of the rainforest in Africa. Interestingly, the rainforest of Amazon, sorry, not Africa. The rainforest of Amazon actually produce their own rainfall. So because of global warming and because of deforestation, the Amazon rainforest is dying. It probably would reach a certain tipping point pretty soon. And then we have coral. Corals are pretty sensitive to high temperature, high sea surface temperature. And if the temperature were to rise to 2 degrees above the industrial level, which is 250 years ago, then all corals in the world will die. So that would be a disaster for the ecosystem, and also a disaster for a lot of people who depend on coral reef for the living, the fishermen, the tourist industry, and so forth and so on. And another one is the West Antarctica ice sheet. If you look at this graph, if you look at this graph, you will know that this ice shelf actually protrudes out from the continent into the ocean. By itself, it's very unstable. But to make matters worse, there is a warm under-ocean current undercutting the ice shelf. So there is a chance, a real chance, that the whole ice shelf can collapse and drift in the open sea. In that case, it melts and will bring a rise of sea level for up to 5 meters. And then I'm going to just mention one last tipping point, which is what we call the Gulf Stream. We know that in the Atlantic Ocean, there is a warm ocean current running from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the northern Atlantic, and that explains why England or UK is much milder than Beijing, although UK is much further north. Normally we expect places further north to be very cold, frigid, and so on. But in that case, UK and Western Europe is much milder than it should be, thanks to the Gulf Stream. But because of global warming, because of melting of glaciers and so on, this Gulf Stream could be disrupted and slowed down. And in that case, UK and countries further north will suffer from very cold weather. So how are we doing? Well, this again is a very complicated chart. I don't know what you can't see the cursor, but probably you can see the second curve from the top, which means the current policy scenario. Taking all policies of all countries in the world, it will take us to 2.8 degrees above the pre-industrial level. But I have circled in the bottom 1.5 degrees and 2.0 degrees. Now those are the aspirations or the objective reached in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, all scientists in all countries in the world agree that we should limit the rise of temperature not more than 2 degrees and endeavor to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So you can see that there is a big gap between the current policies and the aspiration of the Paris Agreement. But we shouldn't be, I don't know, be too pessimistic. Because you see that the first graph, in the topmost graph, are actually the projection in 2010 according to the policy event. So we can see that 10 years ago or 12 years ago, then the policy would bring us to a very hot world. Now 12 years later, the existing policy will bring the world to at most something like 2.8 degrees Celsius above the industrial level. So we are actually seeing some progress, although the progress is still, not satisfactory according to the science expectation. So we still have to work out. And that brings to the end of my sharing. This is a very interesting chart about the wind farm over the ocean, and we can see the wind farm actually generates weather of its own. But this is not the purpose of using this graph. It's just an interesting photo. What I'm trying to say from this photograph is that all solutions of climate change, I cannot think of any solution of climate change which can be done without the help of you, the chemical engineers. Take, for instance, the wind farm, take, for instance, the solar panels, take, for instance, how to improve our efficiency of everything at all, and so on. So your role as a solution for the climate problem is indispensable. So with that, I'll stop and and I'll probably will answer a couple of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your beautiful sharing. Now it's a 5 minutes Q&A section. Please don't hesitate to raise your hands and ask questions. The staff will answer your points soon. For members who join the events group meetings, you can also type your questions in the chat box.
Don't ask me to rain outside. I'm not responsible for that. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I didn't bring any umbrella with me.
Questions? Yeah, I'll ask a question. So let's say for coral real dying off in Hong Kong, what we can do locally, let's say maybe me, myself, what we can do for this problem?
I think there are two approaches. One we call is litigation. Litigation is to soften the root cause of the problem, which is, reduce carbon dioxide emission in all aspects of our life. So this is most important. And then the other part is, of course, adaptation. And if I understand correctly, some people, some scholars, some scientists in Hong Kong are already doing that. And scientists in China are already doing that. They are using all kinds of structures to produce an environment which is more conducive for the coral reef to survive under high temperature scenario. They use 3D printers, they try different materials to help the corals to find a suitable habitat. So I know that scientists are doing that. And the other approach is that we select and groom those species of corals which are more heat resistant. And then we try to, populate those corals, and hopefully they will populate all over the world, and then the problem is partially solved. Yes, please.
Professor, I think climate change is just a political issue rather than a scientific issue. There are already enough technology to solve the problem if we can gather the view of the people to do that. All the COP27, 27 years, we're asking about who to pay for it and how to pay for it. That's the issue. And I don't think the last COP27 has solved the problem. The amount of money they put together to help the poor countries, has been very long to do it. And the sacrifice the richest countries are not willing or want to solve the problem. That is the problem itself. But I think for Hong Kong, we need to come up with a political solution to champion saving the world, not just saving Hong Kong.
Yeah, thank you. I think yours is more an opinion than a question. I totally agree with you. And as a matter of fact, the very basis of climate change, of climate crisis, is that of science and technology. For science and technology, it's very clear. Scientists know the way. Engineers like you all know the way how to solve the problem. Unfortunately, it becomes a political problem, particularly in the U.S. Before Joe Biden, we have Donald Trump, who is totally against any climate action at all, and he withdrew U.S. from the Paris Agreement and things like that. So whenever anything becomes politicized, it will be very, very difficult. So I don't know. I think Hong Kong, we have a better kind of atmosphere where we can do more active or progressive climate actions, and hopefully that would be the same for other parts of the world.
Awesome, very short questions. Thank you for the inspiring presentation. So you just mentioned in the worst case there was a 5 meters rise in the water level. Can you help us to visualize if 5 meters, how many percent of Hong Kong, for example, Central may disappear? Can you help us to visualize if that's a never happen?
I think some think tank in Hong Kong, Civic Exchange, has done that many years ago. They have scenarios for 1 meter rise and up to 6 meter rise and so on. For 5 or 6 meters rise, I think we don't have any central districts. The MTRs are all like Zhengzhou last year. You know, Zhengzhou last year we had torrential rain, and the subway completely flooded and so on. So all this situation, all this could happen. But of course, according to our current understanding, the tipping point for the Western Antarctica ice sheet to occur is not 1.5 degrees, is not 2 degrees, is a little bit higher. So we still have time to prevent that from happening. So climate action is to prevent the unmanageable. We have to prevent the unmanageable, because if the Western Antarctica ice sheet should melt, then it is unmanageable. So we have to prevent that from happening. That is exactly the entire idea about tipping points.
Once again, thank you, Professor Leung, for your useful sharing.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Please.